Okay, I think we are ready to start. A lot of people will walking, so my apologies on their behalf. But good morning again. My name is Orhan. I'm the director of the Atlantic Council Energy and Economic Summit, and I am truly honored again to be joined by two distinguished members of and friends of the Atlantic Council Energy and Economic Summit, Ambassador Pascual and Dr. Birol. As Fred Kemp mentioned in his closing remarks, this has become known as the Birol and Pascual Show. We used to have this session on global energy outlook, or world economic outlook, energy outlook, I should say, on Friday mornings as an eye-opener, which drew huge crowds. And when we decided to move it to the opening day, the Thursday time slot, none of our other speakers wanted to be on any other panel competing with this. So we are very fortunate and lucky that we are the single spot right now. Our just housekeeping notes, this session is on the records. Please turn your phones off. And if you want to use, you can use the hashtag AC Summit. And the way that we are going to conduct this, like most of our panels, is after a very brief introduction by me. First, Dr. Birol is going to do his presentation, followed by Ambassador Pascual's presentation, and then hopefully we will have a very long Q&A session, which I think is the heart and soul of this particular session. We have reserved a generous time for this, but don't worry, we are not going to be late for the lunch where the secretary is going to be the keynote speaker. Typically, there is absolutely no reason to introduce any of our distinguished guests today, but there are some news regarding at least one of them. So let me start by introducing Ambassador Carlos Pascual, who is now a fellow and senior research scholar at the Center on Global Policy at Columbia University. I am also thrilled to find out that you are now a part of the Atlantic Council Board. We will definitely benefit from your expertise. As again Fred mentioned, Ambassador Pascual was a former US ambassador to Mexico and Ukraine, and most recently, as we all know, the special envoy and coordinator for international energy affairs at the US State Department. Welcome back, Ambassador. Our first speaker, if I may say so, will be our good friend, a true heart Galatasaray fan, Dr. Fatih Birol. Everybody knows that Fatih Bey's passion with soccer and Galatasaray, but I just realized that very few people know what actually his name means. Fatih means in Turkish. It means conqueror, the one who conquers. I think he has conquered several audiences in the past years as the chief economist of the International Energy Agency. Without further ado, we are delighted, thrilled to have both of you here. And Dr. Birol always publishes his Global Energy Outlook on my birthday, November 12th. So only after, almost a week after this landmark publication again, we are lucky to have him here. And if I may just give you the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, a very good morning to all of you. It's a great pleasure to come back to Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Mr. Tanner, for inviting me. And also, echoing what Mr. Kemp said a few minutes ago, a heartfelt congratulations, Orhan Bey, transforming this Atlantic Council to a very, very important center where several people who are directly working on energy and who are indirectly working on energy to come here and discuss the global energy issues. And it's a great privilege for me to share this session with Ambassador Pascual, from whom I got a lot of inspiration in my work. and had the opportunity to discuss several times. Thank you very much, Ambassador, to share the podium with me today. As Mr. Taner said, we did publish the World Energy Outlook on his very birthday, so happy birthday to you too, Mr. Taner. I didn't know that it was your birthday, but it was the birthday of our book as well. And with our book this year, I did discover something. Some of you may know that this book is the best-selling energy book in the world. And I thought our sales increase every year, and I thought there was a correlation between the oil prices and our sales. When the oil prices went up, our sales went up, and so I was watching the oil prices very carefully. And this year, I was a bit skeptical about the sales since the oil prices went down by $35. And I just found out that our sales did still increase despite the decline in oil prices. So this made me very happy. Two good news at the same time: lower oil prices and at the same time higher World Energy Outlook sales. And a birthday present to you, perhaps, Mr. Taner. So looking at the future of energy, we see at the current context where we are in signs of stress in the global energy system. First of all, yes, there is a calm in the energy markets today, especially in the oil markets, and we see that the oil prices went down considerably. But I believe, and this is the first message I want to give here today, this shouldn't mask the energy security, oil security problems lying ahead, especially the turmoil in Middle East. Iraq, a very important oil province for today and for the future. Libya, generally in Middle East, tells us that the oil security remains a key issue despite the oil prices going down. Second, in terms of gas security, once again, we observe the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, what we have observed a few years ago. And as Minister Yildiz underlined, it seems that the story is not over yet, reminds us that the gas security will remain a major issue as well. And I am sure Ambassador Pascual will elaborate the Ukraine issue more in depth. To sum up, the first message I want to share with you is energy security, oil and gas, will remain high up in the international policy agenda in the next years to come. Second, about climate change. We are getting mixed signals about climate change. Recent China-US joint commitment about reduction of CO2 emissions following the European Union's target of reducing the emissions by 40% 2030, they all give us hope, and I will elaborate in a minute. But when we look at the current numbers, ladies and gentlemen, they are very depressing. Last year, according to World Energy Outlook, in 2013, carbon dioxide emissions increased 2.6% again, putting the world perfectly on track of a temperature increase of 3.6 degrees Celsius, which, as we all know, would have catastrophic implications for all of us. And of that increase, 60% of the increase came from one country only, 60% of that increase, namely China. Another important issue when we talk about climate change and global energy system is the fossil fuel subsidies, an issue which was also discussed in Brisbane, and I see that the Turkish G20 presidency will also look at it. What is that fossil fuel subsidies? Today, several countries in the world, especially emerging countries, Middle East, China, Russia, India, Indonesia, there are $550 billion of subsidies for coal, oil, and gas, putting the price of these products substantially down, much lower than their own value. And if something is so cheap, we human beings tend to use it in an inefficient, not in a careful way. So what does 550 billion governments giving to the consumers? It means the following. Governments are saying to the citizens, if you pollute the world, I will reward you for that. I will give you money for that. Or, please use the energy inefficiently. Don't care about the prices. I will take care of the price consequences. This is the message going to the citizens, consumers, and users. And the lower oil prices now are giving an opportunity to many governments to phase out those subsidies because they are a major burden on the government budget as well. A very recent and a very good example is Indonesia. Last week, Indonesia made a major reform in the energy prices, phasing out a substantial part of the subsidies, especially gasoline prices. A very important issue, and I expect other countries to follow. Now, efficiency. This is a very important issue, and Mr. Secretary also highlighted the efficiency issue. In such meetings, government speeches, government programs, slides, we talk about efficiency a lot in the last 6-7 years. It was an issue that everybody agreed. But, ladies and gentlemen, now for the first time, we are seeing the concrete impact on efficiency policies on the energy demand trends. It is very important. Anybody who doesn't understand the impact of efficiency on the demand may well make wrong decisions in terms of investments, in terms of plans, projects, and so on. Today, for example, when we talk about efficiency and the transportation sector, for the first time in the world, 3 out of 4 new cars sold in the world, 3 out of 4, is subject to some type of fuel efficiency standards. It's new, which puts a downward pressure on oil demand growth. Japan and Europe was followed by the first Obama administration, putting the CAFE standards, and China, India are making efforts there, which all will put a downward pressure on the oil demand growth in the next years to come. And to finish the first thoughts about the current picture, we think that there will be a major changes looking at these 2 stress points on energy security and climate change. And the question is whether these changes will be led by public policies, government policies, together with markets, or these changes will be led by the events themselves. Now, looking at the future, we see a rather different future energy demand prospect compared to last 10 years. In the last 10 years, global energy demand increased by 30%, a very strong growth. And of this growth, 50% came from one country. Half of the global energy demand growth came from one country, which is China. When we look at the OECD countries, US, Europe, Japan, their energy demand was more or less flat, and we expect this to be flat in the next years to come. Economic growth will push it up a bit, and the efficiency measures will push it down, and we expect in some OECD demand will be more or less flat. And the important news is, at least for me, China demand growth slows down considerably. China, which was the engine of the global demand growth, is slowing down. And we already have the first signals of that. Why China is slowing down, which will have implications for oil markets, coal markets, climate change, investment for everybody in the world, given the sheer size of China. Why China is slowing down? 3 reasons. First, I mentioned the efficiency policies. If there is one country in the world I have to pick up, which is extremely serious about the efficiency policies, putting them forward, implementing them, and monitoring the results, this is China. And this is not driven by the climate change reasons, mainly. This is mainly driven by the cost effectiveness and local pollution reasons. This is the one reason. Second, Chinese economy is slowing down, and at the same time, the structure of the economy is moving from a heavy industry-based economy to a lighter economy, slowly but surely. It's the second reason. Third reason why China energy demand is slowing down is because Chinese population growth is very soon coming to a peak and will start to decline. The aging process is starting like Japan a few years ago. As a result of these 3 reasons, China energy demand, the dragon, slows down, and this is very important for the global energy markets. When we look at the coal, for example, it is extremely important, the coal markets, what's happening. China coal consumption in the last 10 years until 2011 increased every year 10%, 10% per year. And last 2 years, it increased only 5%. And the difference between 10% and 5% is entire coal consumption of all the other Asian countries put together. Just put it in a context, how important it is, and implications of that on the coal prices, again, coal prices versus gas prices competition, and others. And the demand growth in the future will come from India, a key driver, followed by the East Asian countries and the Middle East countries themselves, a very strong growth coming from there. So in the future, we are going to see a 3-speed energy demand growth, flat OECD, slowing down of China, and very strong in the emerging Asian countries. Now, we have a lot of colleagues from United States here, and Orhan Bey made an excellent organization here in this very beautiful hotel, but he couldn't manage one thing, which is the weather. We have, as I see, we have a horrible weather, and therefore, in order to compensate the bad news about the weather, I have a good news about the US economy for the next years to come. And I hope it will be a good compensation. Namely, what we see is that the US economy will enjoy several years to come lower energy costs for the consumers compared to almost all other competitors. What we have done is that we look at what the consumers, households, industry pay on average for 1 unit of energy in different parts of the world in the past and in the future. When we look at the 2008 US cost to economy of energy was lower than Europe and Japan. It was before the shale revolution. And after the shale revolution today, while the cost of energy to economy, what the consumers pay, increased in Europe and Japan and anywhere in the world, in the United States, it went down. This is the cost you pay for gasoline, electricity, natural gas for at home, at the industry, and so on. This is something that is very noteworthy as a result of mainly the shale revolution. But more importantly, when we look at the future, we see that the gap between US vis-a-vis Europe and Japan will remain significant in terms of lower cost. But more importantly, we see that the US will be even lower cost than China. Mainly China saying slowly but surely goodbye to cheap but dirty coal, or lowering the share of that. And this would put the US cost of energy at a lower level compared to not only the OECD competitors, but also to that of China, providing a very strong position for the US economy for many years to come. Now, a few words on the oil markets. When we look at the oil markets, first of all, we expect the global oil demand will increase in a healthy way about 14 million barrels per day in the next 25 years, mainly driven by the Asian countries and transportation sector, 14 million barrels per day. The question is, how are we going to meet that demand growth? Who are the countries which will bring oil to the markets? Now, we identify 4 strong shoulders: US, Canada, Brazil, and Middle East. But here, timing and the amount of the contribution of these countries are of crucial importance to understand. The other countries, other producers, when you put them together, group them, North Sea, Russia, Mexico, and so on, their total production is slightly in decline. But we expect US shale oil to continue to contribute to the global oil supply. It's a very good news for the global economy, energy security, but the amount of oil which will come from United States will be slowing down around 2020s, and the contribution is a very limited part of the total global oil demand growth. So it is very important to put this in a context. How much oil will come from United States vis-a-vis how much the world needs oil. Canada, mainly from oil sands, we expect the production growth to come, and Brazil, especially with the deepwater offshore projects, will make a significant contribution. But ladies and gentlemen, especially around 2020s, we need to see a significant growth coming from Middle East. Without the growth coming from Middle East around 2020s, we have no chance whatsoever to meet the growth in the demand with affordable prices. And the question is the following. In order to see a production growth in 2020s in Middle East, and half of it needs to come from Iraq according to our projections, projections of the US government, for EU, for everybody, being a very virgin country, easy geology, and so on. In order to see a production growth in 2020s, we have to invest today. The lead time of a project in oil, there are many oil colleagues here who know that better than me, you need 5 to 6 years, 7 years in certain cases. And today, looking at the insecurity in Middle East, especially in Iraq, I do not see this great appetite for investments. In Iraq, to be able to see a modest growth in production, which we expect, there is a need for each year $15 billion of investments. Resources are there, very easy geology and everything. But today's instability in Middle East and Iraq is a major risk for those investments. Therefore, a very good news, the US production growth for all of us, for the global oil security, but we do need Middle East oil, and the current situation in Middle East is a big question whether or not these investments will be forthcoming. Now, how these current prices change this picture or affect this picture? First of all, why do we have lower prices? Prices are going down for 2 reasons. Significant amount of new oil production coming from US, followed by Canada, very good news. Second, demand is weaker oil demand because of the European economy being weak and Chinese economy slowing down, Japan being in recession. Combining of these two means downward pressure on the prices. But will it last forever? I don't think so, for the following reasons. First of all, lower prices are going to put downward pressure on the oil investments, especially for high-cost areas. And here, especially for North American oil, US oil and Canadian oil sands, if there will be a continued downward pressure on the prices, investments there may face some challenges. Or in Brazil, bulk of the investments made in Brazil by Petrobras are financed through cash flows of selling the oil. And when the prices go down, revenues go down, Petrobras needs to get a lot of debts in order to make this investment happen, which is another challenge. So, first, lower prices will put downward pressure on the investments and the production growth for the future. Second, again, current oil price levels, of course, is a very good news for the consumers, as Secretary Moniz mentioned, for the countries like Turkey, for the trade balance, giving a breathing space for the important countries. But the lower prices may well mean putting upward pressure on the demand growth. So if the price goes down significantly, people may well use it more if the efficiency measures are not there. So putting these two things together, downward pressure on the investments for new production, upward pressure for the demand growth as a result of lower prices may well mean that we need more and more oil from low-cost Middle East producers, which in turn is going to face a major instability challenge. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, my expectation is lower prices are very good for the economy, providing a comfort zone for the consumers, but we have to think about its consequences very carefully for the future. Natural gas, growing everywhere, very strongly, consumption, very bright future, entire world, except for one region, which is Europe. In Europe, the gas, if I might say so, there is a very famous Turkish film which got the Cannes Film Festival, the best prize of Nuri Bilge Ceylan, the same name. European gas consumption is in a winter sleep. It doesn't grow. Our numbers show that the European gas consumption will rebound to pre-2010 levels only around 2030s. But the demand not growing doesn't mean that the import needs are not growing. Imports will be growing because of the decline of the European domestic gas production. It's declining significantly. And where the new imports will come from will be of crucial importance for European policymakers from an energy security point of view. And today, Europe is trying to diversify its energy gas sources, and yet there is a good opportunity, namely LNG. What we expect is the LNG, in terms of volumes, are going to double, looking at the projects today which are under construction. It's the good news for the flexibility of the markets. But the other good news is that not only the volumes are increasing, but the number of countries which export LNG are increasing. So there will be more countries which will be produce more LNG, which is a very good news for the diversification of the gas markets and for the global gas security. We see new players coming in the market, such as US, Canada. Australia is growing very, very strongly. And from Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique are becoming significant players. So for Europe and for other countries, this is definitely a very good news. However, I should tell you that this LNG, while it provides a very good opportunity for the flexibility of the markets, making the hands of the importers stronger, it will be rather too optimistic to think that we will have a one gas prices and it will bring the gas prices significantly down. There will be still significant differences in terms of prices, even though the increasing LNG will provide more flexibility in terms of the gas contracts, but we shouldn't have very, very high expectations in terms of the price effect. So, power plants, a very important part of the game. And especially for the OECD countries, there's a very important message. In the OECD countries, in Europe, US, electricity demand is not growing very much, but we have to build a lot of new power plants. Why? Because a big chunk of our current power plants are going to retire, coming to the end of their lifetime very soon, and we have to replace them. Worldwide today, we have about 6,000 gigawatts of power plants, the entire world. And in the next 25 years, we see 40% of those power plants are going to retire, finish. When we look at Europe, for example, we have a lot of colleagues from Europe here as well. In Europe today, 60% of the existing power plants are going to retire. This means a huge challenge for investments, but at the same time, a major opportunity to redesign the power system in Europe or in OECD in general. If you want to go from coal to renewables or gas, if you want to go from centralized to decentralized, it will all provide a very important option. And in the future, when we look, we see a major penetration of renewable energies worldwide. About 50%, half of the new power capacity will come from renewable energies. Wind, hydro, solar, mainly as a result of government support, but at the same time, declining cost of renewable energies in many cases. But increasing share of renewables impose certain challenges in terms of system reliability. For example, in Europe, there is a need to support the renewables with a power system, such as large hydro, gas, or whatever, which can provide electricity 24 hours. Before coming to end of my words, one word on nuclear power, an important topic in Turkey and in many countries, a debate. Every year in the World Energy Outlook, we look at one fuel in depth. We look at all the fuels, but one fuel in depth, 1 year oil, 1 year gas, coal, and this year we look at the nuclear power. And when we look at the future of nuclear power, we see that many countries are still is underlined, building nuclear power plants. And while some want to say goodbye to nuclear power. We expect the nuclear will grow significantly, but this growth will not mean, with the current policies, a nuclear renaissance. It is not in sight yet. When we look at the countries in Europe, we expect the nuclear capacity will decline, mainly as a result of retirements, with the normal retirements, plus some countries like Germany, Belgium, want to phase out their nuclear capacity. Every country is, of course, free to choose what they do, but the countries which want to say goodbye to nuclear power plants, or the countries which do not want to replace retired nuclear power plants, have to find the answer to the following question. With which fuel I am going to compensate the declining nuclear, and what are the economic, environmental, and energy security implications of that very trend? Now, Japan, we expect, will slowly but surely get some of the nuclear power plants on stream. Some new ones are going to be built. But even though nuclear will play an important role in Japan energy mix in the future, it will be less than what was thought before Fukushima. In US, despite the shale gas revolution, we see in the United States today 6 gigawatts of new nuclear power plants are under construction. Nuclear program is continuing, and Russia, India are making major nuclear projects, and a significant amount of power plants are under construction. However, ladies and gentlemen, there is one country which is very important in this game, which is China. China is responsible about half of the growth in nuclear capacity in the next 25 years. Even today, we have about 80 gigawatts of nuclear power plants in place, or under construction today, 80 gigawatts, and half of it is in China under construction. In the future, it will be the same trend. And this has two implications. One, China, building their own technology, getting from West, now Chinese are now able to put the cost of nuclear down with the technology they have. And cost is a major issue for nuclear. So I wouldn't be surprised very soon China exporting nuclear technology and competing with some European countries, North American countries, and Japan and Korea. A very important front for the Western countries, the nuclear technology, and China may well be the driver of the exporting nuclear technology. Another one implication, this picture. Today, 80% of the nuclear plants are in OECD countries, 20% in non-OECD countries. And as a result of this picture, tomorrow it will be 50% OECD, 50% non-OECD. And this will have definitely some implications for all of us. One of the major reasons why we see that the nuclear is not moving as strongly as some people would like to see is the public concerns, among which I want to underline one of them. Most of the nuclear power plants have been built in the last 40, 50 years. And up to now, only about 10 nuclear power plants retire. And we try to deal with them. But in a very short period of time, in 20 years, very short period of time, we will see a wave of retirements of nuclear power plants. 200 nuclear power plants are retired, and we have to decommission them. And they are not the easy things to decommission. And the world is not well prepared how to decommission 200 nuclear power plants. I don't know any single country who is perfectly ready for this very challenge. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me finish my words to talk briefly on climate change. Now, what is the problem with the climate change? The problem is the following. Energy sector is the main responsible sector for climate change, first of all. More than 2/3 of the emissions leading to climate change come from the energy sector, and without solving the problem in the energy sector, we have no chance whatsoever to solve the climate change problem. And the issue is the following. The world leaders agreed, based on the scientists' recommendation, the maximum the world can warm is 2 degrees Celsius. If the world temperature increase about 2 degrees Celsius around that level, we can have a world which is more or less similar to the world what we have now. This the scientists told us, and the entire world leaders agreed to that. Now, where are we with these 2 degrees as the human beings? Mother Nature gave us a budget, told us, you human beings, you have 2,300 gigatons of CO2 budget. You can emit that much, but if you emit more than this, you are in trouble. Then you go beyond 2 degrees and you have a different world. And we looked where we are with that budget given to us, in other words, allowance to dirty up the world. In the last 100 years or so, we have seen, as a result of industrial revolution, using a lot of fossil fuels, we have already used up, consumed half of the budget given to us. 50% is gone, where we are today. And with the trends I showed to you, with our central scenario, we are going to consume the rest of the budget around 2040. So which means to be able to have a world similar to this one, as of 2041, 42, whatever it is, emissions need to drop to 0 for the rest of our lives. So it means no oil, no gas, no coal use, which is completely impossible. So with the current policies, with the current trends, we are facing exceed the budget which is given to us, because emissions in 2030, 2040 are already destined today with the power plants we have today, or the cars, or the industry, or the factories, and so on. And this is definitely a very, very important trend. But there is a good news. The very good news of the last week, in addition to having the birthday of Orhan Bey, was the President Xi and President Obama jointly made a commitment to reduce the CO2 emissions. This is, ladies and gentlemen, extremely important for several reasons, at least 2 of them. One, in terms of numbers. As we all know, Europe already committed to reduce the emissions, and Europe's emissions are about 15% of the global emissions. China plus US make 45% of the global emissions, almost half of it. It means US plus China plus Europe make 60% of the emissions. A big portion. It's a very good news for the climate change, this commitment. Second, maybe more importantly, this US-China commitment will inject a very strong political momentum on the road to Paris. It will be very difficult for many countries to avoid not to be part of a group of countries, European leaders, US, China, which try to find a solution to a major problem of the mankind. There's a political aspect to that as well. And why Paris is so important? Paris is so important because the trend, the half of the budget, can be altered if we move the investment in energy sector in a cleaner way. And to do that, we need a signal from Paris. How do we give the signal? It can be international agreement, for example. Why important to give the signal to clean energy investments? Because today, they are in a poor level. Today, we talk about the renewables and so on, but when you look at all the investments for the clean energy investments, for efficiency renewables, they're about 400 billion US dollar. In our central scenario, which brings us a ending of the budget, or 3.6 degrees temperature increase, they are doubling. In order to change the trend, to go to a 2 degrees trajectory, clean energy investments need to increase by 4 times. And this can only happen if there's a signal given to investors. And Paris, I believe, is a last chance for that if we want to again enjoy the planet that we used to know since centuries. So let me finish my presentation by telling you that we think the energy security will move high up in the international policy agenda. volatility in the Middle East raises serious questions about the investments coming to the very region, and as such, the production growth for the global oil markets around 2020s. When we talk about the African countries, we didn't talk much today, but the many African countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa, when we look at those countries, the energy strategies remain at the heart of the poverty reduction and economic growth. And without getting a clear direction from Paris, we have no chance whatsoever to keep the world with a 2 degrees trajectory. And finally, I am a man who believes on the market principles are the best to address the energy sector. Market rules, market instruments. However, given the complexity of the 2 challenges we are facing today, energy security, energy, economy, defense, geopolitics, foreign policy, very complex. Climate change, the urgency, the investment, again, foreign policy and everything. I think it is very important that we have far-sighted government policies, not only looking today, but also tomorrow, and public policies in order to steer the world into a safer and a sustainable future. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatih Bey. I have to admit that you use your time budget very generously, but you are so hard to interrupt. And let's see what Ambassador Pascual is going to say about new public policies and policies by governments. Ambassador Pascual.
Thank you very much, Orhan. It's a real pleasure to be back here again, to be here as a friend of the Atlantic Council, to have an opportunity to participate with you on the board. Always just a wonderful opportunity to participate with Fatih Birol. I probably don't get too nervous these days when I give a talk, but I always get nervous when I talk with Fatih because he actually knows what he's talking about more than anybody else, and he brings a depth of knowledge and specificity into these discussions, which is absolutely critical to the work that we do. In some ways, you're going to get 2 presentations today from the IEA, because I cannot do the work that I do on the geopolitics of energy if it were not for the work that the IEA does on giving us the basic platform of data and analysis that we need in order to understand what's happening in global energy markets. And I thank you very much for that, Fatih. And I also thank Adnan Amin, who's sitting in the front row and is the Secretary General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is increasingly playing that role on the renewable energy side. I want to talk to you today about a topic which I'm calling the new geopolitics of energy, and how geopolitical issues get spun into these many questions of what's happening in energy markets. I'm going to take you through a few different topics, and I'm going to start out with the price of oil, because it's such a big topic in the world today. What does it mean to have oil at $80 a barrel for Brent crude? Is it going to go lower? Is it going to go higher? What is the impact on countries like Venezuela or Brazil that need shadow prices of $120 or $140 for a barrel of oil to balance their budget, or Russia, $100? What does it mean for countries like Mexico that are starting a massive energy reform and need tens of billions of dollars of investment, and is that investment going to come? And much of that's going to depend on how people see what is happening in oil markets and on the price of oil. And I very much agree with what Fatih said in the longer term, of still seeing a great degree of, say, resilience in the price of oil. But what happens in the next year to year and a half is going to make a huge difference. So let's start out with this perspective here. So look at the price of oil in October of 2010 and October of 2014. And wow, it's about the same in the 80s, the mid-80s. And what happened in between? We started out with this increase in prices as a result of the Libyan civil war, another major increase in prices as a result of sanctions on Iran, and we ended up in the same price range. And what happened during that period of time? Well, in some ways it's not surprising. If you look at what has happened on global oil supply and demand, the red is supply, and it's increased about 4 million barrels a day over that period of time. The blue is demand, and it's projected outward on this chart. It's increased a little bit under 4 million barrels a day. And a big factor behind that has been what's happened in the United States, increasing oil production 1 million barrels a day every year in 2012, 2013, and on track this year in 2014. So an addition of more than Mexico, more than Kuwait, more than UAE, just to give you a sense of that scale. Now, while that has happened, this also has occurred. These are unplanned crude oil production disruptions that we've seen in the market. And as opposed to the past, when these disruptions have been in the range of 200,000, 500,000 barrels a day, they've reached at a point in time 3.3 million barrels a day in May of this year. And so what's happened in the marketplace? Well, a funny thing happened over the course of the summer. Libya came back onto the market and added maybe 700,000 barrels a day. Nigeria, I would say, controlled its corruption a little bit and added another 300,000 barrels a day. The marketplace started to ask another question. Oh my God, we've been able to balance supply and demand while at the same time having these disruptions. What happens if some of this disrupted oil comes back onto the market? And so suddenly the price of oil started to diminish, because if you ask yourself the question, was North American production a surprise? No. Was the compression of the economies in Asia a surprise? No. What did surprise people was that some of this oil could start to come back into markets. And so let's say if we take $80 to $85 a barrel of oil today and ask ourselves the question, what's it going to look like over the next year? I would argue that if we start with the balances between supply and demand, that in North America we're going to see continued growth. And I'll come back to why I think that's the case in a second. On demand, we've seen, Fatih's already outlined that China is slowing. We still see significant growth out of other countries in Asia, but let's say a general slowing of demand in Asia. And in the OECD, it's been flat, absolutely flat or contracting, partly as a result of energy efficiency measures. Right? And then let's look at risks. Are we going to see risks of disruption, such as potential issues related to ISIS in Iraq? Or is Libya going to go off the market? Are we going to see problems with Nigeria? Or might we see another type of disruption in the market through additions? Greater additions coming out of Iran if there is a nuclear deal, or Russia or Saudi Arabia. And if we look at these factors together, I think it starts to point us to, on the one hand, still very strong supply growth against a relatively flat market, and a risk scenario which shows perhaps as much probability of more oil coming onto the market as oil going off of the market. Let me come back to the North American scene for a second. This data comes from a small company in the United States called Drilling Info, which is indicative of the kind of innovation that we're having in the application of information technology to data on production. And so on the y-axis, what you see on the A, B, C, D, E, and F, and G are gradations of the quality of rock. And the best is at the top, and the worst is at the bottom. And what we're starting to see is an amazing disparity among American producers as better and better technologies are introduced in the market. And so the best producers are on the right-hand side of that chart. And increasingly what we're seeing is that the difference between the best and the median is getting to be 40%, and the best and the worst is getting to be in the range of 70%. And when you translate this into oil prices, look at this. On the right-hand part of this chart, you have the worst oil, shale oil fields. This is for tight oil for shale. And on the left-hand side, you have the best fields. And so on the right-hand side, what you can see is that the median producers need $100 a barrel to break even, but others are making money at $70 and $60 a barrel. And you come down and you start looking at other qualities of rock, and at $70 and $60, the median producers are doing okay, but you're getting companies that are making a fortune at $40 a barrel, $45 a barrel, and some even below. And this innovation is spurring greater consolidation of the industry. And as prices come down, we potentially are going to see even more consolidation over time. So don't expect the American oil industry to stop producing as a result of these lower prices of oil. So what does that mean from a geopolitical perspective? So let's look at this. So in the past, if we looked at the world of energy from China's perspective, it really looked at where does your energy come from and how do you get energy security? And from China's perspective, you looked at it and you saw, wow, you're worried about the Middle East, you're worried about choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and then a couple of other choke points throughout the world. And what's China's strategy been in the past? To diversify, increasingly to diversify. And what's it going to do when the price of oil is low? It's going to diversify. And what's going to happen on the part of major producers around the world who are looking at the reverse side of this picture? And you're potentially asking the question, is Iran going to come back into the market? Is Iraq going to be able to achieve its production potential? Is Nigeria going to get its act together at some time and bring more oil into the market? Is the pre-salt in Brazil going to be successful? And what is Saudi Arabia doing when it looks at this? Well, it's doing exactly what Saudi Arabia said it was going to do. It's going to fight for market share. I don't think this is Saudi Arabia fighting for market share against the United States. The Saudis know that the U.S. producers are hedged in their prices. The Saudis know the structure of production in the United States. They are fighting for market share in the growing parts of the market in the world. And even though China is slowing down, China and Asia is the one part of the world where energy demand is increasing. So look ahead to the future, to greater competition among producers. Look at that competition vis-a-vis how they can engage in Asian countries because of the importance of that market. And look at the rest of the world providing a more stable base of production that allows for diversification and competition throughout the international system. Now let's go to Iraq. Iraq is obviously a topic that hangs over this whole conference. And the conflict that we have seen there is devastating and tragic. And underpinning it has been what has happened with ISIS and the future of ISIS. And so we ask ourselves the question, what has to happen to bring a degree of normalcy, tranquility, and peace in Iraq? How to deal with the ISIS question, and what can bring stability in the region? And oil, I would argue, has been a factor for both instability and stability, as Minister Yildiz said this morning. We have to recognize that the foundation for ISIS has been the disenfranchisement of the Sunni people in Iraq. And as a result of that, it's generated a movement that has not only become tremendously violent, but it has allowed them to entrench itself with the populations, the Sunni populations in the western and northern parts of the country. And so in order to be able to defeat this movement, it's not only going to take military action, it's going to take creating a belief among the Sunnis of Iraq that they will benefit from the riches and the potential of the country as well. And so one of the key factors that we have to fight against is what is financing ISIS and how to transfer that sense of those resources to a sense of greater potential by other actors. What we know today is that ISIS is capturing somewhere on the order of 50,000 barrels a day of oil. With discounts, it may be selling it in the range of $20 a barrel. $20 a barrel, it's obviously $1 million a day. At higher prices, do the math, quickly gets us to $2 billion a day if you can get $40 a barrel for this with discounts. That is a small amount for an energy country and company. It is a phenomenal flow of resources for a terrorist organization. And getting those resources out of that organization is going to be critical to being able to win this battle. So what does that mean for Iraq in the future? This chart reflects the status of where we are in Iraq more or less today. Production of about 3.5 million barrels a day. Some of this I know is understated because of questions about official figures of what's coming out of Kirkuk, what's coming out of Kurdistan region. But let's just give this assume that we're somewhere in this range. And what it also tells us is that Iraq can get to 4 million barrels a day probably relatively easily by some continuation of existing investments. But to get to that larger level of projected production of 10 million barrels a day, or anywhere near close to it, we come back to the fundamental issue that Fatih Birol put on the table. Where is investment going to come from, and what's it going to cost to get here? Up to now, we have generally seen the rehabilitation of existing fields. In 6 major super fields, that might have been $3 to $4 billion per field. Going into the future, with new production development, we're more likely going to be in the range of $30 to $40 billion per field. And what's it going to take to actually get there? One critical piece of this is going to be what happens in the southern infrastructure of Iraq. Already we're starting to bump up against infrastructure constraints in pipelines, in pumping capacity, in port capacity. But beyond that, there's a fundamental issue of how contracts are issued and the security of those contracts. Look at it from this perspective. Iraq has been using technical service contracts that essentially use current production of oil to pay the producers of oil. In effect, using current revenues to pay for the cost of production. If you get a tenfold increase in the investments that have to be made to continue to produce, it will simply be impossible for Iraq to do this without turning to other forms of financing contracts, production sharing contracts, and being able to draw on financial markets to be able to finance the cost of these investments. Those issues have to be front and center of the new Iraqi government as they now take power and they look at how they're going to transform the energy infrastructure of this country. Because if they cannot do this, they cannot deliver on the promise of bringing the resources that are needed to bring back that Sunni population, to reach out to the Kurdish population, and be able to keep Iraq together. Kurdistan region is obviously a huge challenge and a familiar topic to the people in this room. So let's just take 3 hypothetical scenarios that are here. First one looks at production in Kurdistan region of 200,000 barrels a day. And I've added onto it the possibility of what happens if 200,000 barrels a day from Kirkuk is controlled by Kurdistan region, and those revenues actually then go back to Kurdistan region as well. And you can see the progression for 300,000 barrels a day and 400,000 barrels a day, and you can mix and match this. And then I've tried to indicate what does it mean in terms of revenue if oil is at $80 a barrel or $100 a barrel. So for Kurdistan region, first scenario, $80 a barrel, $5.8 billion, $7.3 billion if it's at $100 a barrel. If you're bringing Kurdistan region and Kirkuk together, you're potentially looking at revenues of $11 to $14 billion. If you're looking at higher production scenarios, revenues of $17 to $21 billion. Now, Minister Ashti Harami, I think, has told probably everybody in this room that for Iraq to think, for Kurdistan region to think about what would it take to be able to have sufficient revenues to consider independence? Usually about $15 billion. And so it's starting to present a very real question to the Iraqi government, to Kurdistan region, to energy companies, to Iraq's neighbors, of what's going to happen if there isn't a resolution that allows Kurdistan region to be able to export its oil as part of an Iraqi oil export strategy and be adequately compensated for those oil resources. We've seen in recent days indications of a willingness to work together between the Kurdistan region government and the Baghdad government, and an interim agreement that will provide for about 150,000 barrels a day of oil. It is a starting point, but it is not a solution. And this issue fundamentally has to be addressed if Iraq is going to stay together as a state. The other issue that we have to think about is the amount of oil that's crossing borders, and particularly here to Turkey. Perhaps those amounts are relatively small. We know that they are not formal exports. We know that they go by truck. But increasingly, the ability of ISIS to be able to sell what oil and refined products it may be able to get its hands on is going to be critical to sustaining itself as an entity. And so part of any strategy is going to have to come back to how to close off these borders and how to destroy those revenue possibilities, which not only means cutting the borders off, but being able to find other ways to satisfy those consumers. These issues are so fundamental to the stability of Iraq and the region. And the point is that oil can be a source of the solution, but to succeed, all of the actors in the region have to come together and understand how to develop Iraq's resources, how to create adequate export opportunities, how to re-enfranchise the Sunni population of Iraq to feel that it's sharing in the benefits of the country. Let me turn to Europe and issues related to Russia and Ukraine. Some of you have seen this chart before. This is an updated version of it. But here are a couple of critical things. Europe consumes about 500 billion cubic meters a year of gas. A third of that comes from Russia. Half of what comes from Russia goes through Ukraine. Russia has about 220 billion cubic meters of pipelines that have already been built from Russia into the European space. It's exporting now maybe about 165, 167 billion cubic meters. Europe, over this period of time, has made a massive investment in LNG infrastructure. It's made a massive investment in interconnecting pipelines that allow for the trade of gas internally within Europe. And as we've talked about in many cases before, has also put in place a third energy package that does not let any individual company own the gas, own the transit system, and own the distribution. And as a result of that, it started to create a competitive market in Europe for gas that has driven down prices, forced Gazprom to renegotiate prices over the past few years and improve the financing terms. If it were not for this situation, we cannot solve the current crisis in Ukraine, because the solution to the Ukrainian crisis has to be embedded in a wider European solution. Europe has 400 million consumers. Ukraine has a declining population and maybe 42 million consumers. The success for Ukraine is to be incorporated in a wider European market that is the principal market for Russian gas. And what is Russia's alternative? Today, Russia can export 14 BCM of gas in LNG out of Sakhalin Island to Asia. That's about it. Recently signed an agreement with China for another 34 billion cubic meters. It won't come into full effect for another 10 years. Europe has market power. And if it's going to diversify, now is the time to diversify, because of this there is no question. Russia will diversify its export options over time. And now is the opportunity that Europe has to be able to address these issues. So where does Ukraine fit in? I think one of the critical things for us to look at is that Ukraine can survive this winter, but its survival this winter has to be linked with a longer-term strategy on how Ukraine can create a degree of self-sufficiency. So in the past, Ukraine has consumed about 50 billion cubic meters of gas a year. 20 of it produced. It got about 2 billion cubic meters in reverse flows that now come from the western part of Europe and can go back into Ukraine. And you had this gap of about 28. When you look at their storage systems, what Ukraine would usually want to do is start out the year with some degree of storage, draw on it to deal with volatility over the course of the winter, and build up to it so that from June to June, you get a relative balance of the amount that you have. In the past, what that has meant is a need to import 28 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia. Today, tragically, Ukraine is only consuming about 42 billion cubic meters, and it's not because of energy efficiency, it's because of war. It's still producing about 20. It can now get about 7 in reverse flows. It will get that over the course of this year, although a major boost has occurred as a result of work that was done with Slovakia that has created a rate of about 10 billion cubic meters. And so the supply gap that we see for Ukraine is more in the order of about 15 billion cubic meters. If you take from 10 in storage, you're left with a balance of 5. And so if you ask yourself, why was the agreement between Russia and Ukraine that was brokered by the European Union focused around 4 or 5 billion cubic meters? That's why. Because that is the gap that they have to be able to address in order to be able to get through this period. But what about the future? What you really would want to see for Ukraine is that it becomes a unified state, that it restores productive capacity, and that it gets to a demand of 45 billion cubic meters, not because there's conservation due to war, but conservation due to energy efficiency. That it takes advantage of the gas resources that it has to exploit them further and get up to 30 billion cubic meters a year of production. That it take advantage of the reverse flows that currently exist and can be expanded, and ideally, the capacities that are in Hungary that are not being utilized can actually be put to use and get to a level of 15 billion cubic meters. And where does it put Ukraine? Well, Ukraine could be in a situation in 10 years, it didn't have to import any additional amounts of gas. And it could potentially be using its storage system, which has 30 billion cubic meters of capacity, to serve as a foundation for stability in gas markets in the eastern parts of Europe. And whether or not you import from Russia would depend on price. That is the vision it could have in front of itself. And Ukraine now has a huge challenge to be able to act on it and put in place, because the survival of this winter only means something if they can actually get out of the cycle of dependency. Now, all of this has to be looked against Russia's intentions for Ukraine and what it's seeking to do in the region. We've already seen what's happened in the annexation of Crimea. We see in the red and pink areas the intense Russian presence already in terms of equipment and, yes, troops, as has been testified tragically by the number of Russian kids that are returning home in body bags. We've seen President Putin talk about a Novorossiya, which, when you map out what it might look like, cuts across huge swaths of southern Ukraine that could bring it all the way to Moldova. And what are Russia's intents? What are President Putin's intents? I'm not sure we know. And that's what's made this policy scenario so difficult. What we do have a pretty good sense of is that President Putin has responded to what he considers targets of opportunity. Those targets of opportunity took him into Crimea, it's taken them into eastern Ukraine, and where else will they go? And it was as a result of these concerns that sanctions have been imposed by the United States and the European Union on Russia. And those sanctions particularly take into account this fact. Oil is 70% of Russia's export revenue. Oil and gas account for 52% of the budget. If you were able to put a sanction on the development of shale, on deep water development, on the Arctic, the new aspects of Russian energy development, you start to bring into question the potential of the Russian energy sector for the future. You will affect, as a result of that, the cost of financing debt, of refinancing debt. You will have an impact on the exchange rate and a broader impact on the economy. And that's indeed what we're seeing today. If we see the exchange rate, it's depreciated down to a level of 47 rubles to the dollar, and if you look at a basket of currency, it's gone even lower. If you look at inflation on the right-hand side, it's rising. Ironically, one of the things that it's done is that it's created a little bit more competitiveness in the industrial sector. So on the bottom chart, on the left-hand side of the page, you see a little bit of an uptick on the right. But fundamentally, what it's meant is that the Russian people are poor. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, when will this lead to a change of policy in Russia, where it has already proved feckless the UN Security Council because of its veto power, where it's proved feckless the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has to operate by consensus, and where it was not able to put in observers on a massive scale in Crimea. And having undone aspects of the international and regional security system, where does Russia go next? And as a result of those challenges and questions, the likelihood is that we're likely to see more pain, more sanctions, until that pain translates itself into a different set of policies. Let me come back to the question that Fatih raised of climate change and its relationship with energy. Underscoring what Fatih had said, that most of the demand growth is in the non-OECD countries, and if you look at power, it's mostly coming in Asia. But let me go back to a question of how does this look against climate change? So the chart that you see there, the shaded areas, show the growth in energy demand that we see out of the OECD and the non-OECD countries. The dotted white line represents where we are on CO2 emissions. The dotted blue line uses what the IEA calls a new policy scenario, or a central scenario, of what has to happen in reductions on GHG emissions in order to be able to reach a more sensible future outcome. But it's not an ideal outcome. It only gets us to an increase, it only limits us to an increase of 3.6 degrees centigrade in temperature. Is that right, Fatih? All right. So the steps that were just taken by Russia and China maybe keep Russia and China on the new policy scenarios track. Certainly not on the track that brings us down to 2 degrees centigrade. And what we know is that the pace of investments in renewable and the deployment of those renewables is far behind track. And a big factor of this has been coal. And while it may be slowing down, the energy infrastructure that's being created in coal is staying with us. So let's ask the question, why? Now, one of the things that we know is that the price of electricity, whether it's coming from coal or gas or nuclear or wind, is increasingly coming down as a result of innovation. And even in solar, the reason that is so high here is that it reflects distributed generation on households, which is much more expensive. But increasingly, we see electricity being generated somewhere in the range of 9 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And one of the things the IEA has helped us understand is that price matters, but it's not the only reason that people make investments. And so at the bottom of the page, there's a chart from an IEA publication called the Energy Technology Perspectives. And so for any business, how do you invest? You invest on the basis of what's going to make a profit and what's going to generate the highest net present value. And so look at this issue of a load factor, which is the percentage of time that you have electricity available to you at any given time. Just the difference for onshore wind between 20% and 26% makes the difference on whether or not you make or you lose money. And that has been a significant disincentive to investment. Let's look at this chart for a second on investment flows and how this all translates into actual generation capacity. At the top, you have additions to investments to capacity. And renewables look pretty good. They're taking up a significant share of future investments on the top. And you look at the right-hand side of the page, all the way to the right, and you look at the amount of money that's going into renewable investments, and it's outpacing everything else. And then you look to the middle, and you take into account these capacity factors and ask, what does it look like in terms of generation? It's not so good. It's maybe a third. And coal still remains the highest source of power, of fuel for power going into the future. And so what it's starting to tell us is that, first of all, if we think about the carbon budget that Fatih was outlining earlier, we don't have much of it to allocate. If the OECD countries stayed flat, we would use absolutely all of it. For the non-OECD countries to grow, the OECD countries have to come down radically, but the non-OECD countries have to radically cut their projections as well. And that has become the new geopolitics of energy and climate change. I'm only going to say one thing very quickly on this because I've already used too much time. but I just want to reinforce the importance of energy access. On the left-hand side of the page, you have countries with the highest percentage of people that do not have access to electricity. On the right-hand side of the page, you have the numbers of people that are involved. And here what you see is the correlation between energy access and economic growth. And what it's telling us is that if we don't fix this problem, we also have a geopolitical problem. Because those countries in Africa and in India that do not have access to electricity are increasingly going to become the outliers in the global economy, and the sources of tension are going to become greater. I'll leave you with this point. The changes that have occurred in North America have had a huge radical impact on production. There have been times when we've seen that highlighted as a pathway to isolation. We don't need to care about the rest of the world. I hope you understand why that's a false assumption. At times we've seen that talked about as a tool and a weapon that you can use against your friends and to support your friends and hurt your allies. Perhaps you can do that, but you have to understand the market and whether or not you're going to be relevant. And if we're going to play in this world of the new geopolitics of energy, we've got to do it in a way that understands the changing structure of demand, the changing structure of supply, what's happening in the fuel mix, what's happening with the countries that do and don't have access to energy. And the challenges that energy is presenting for national security and foreign policy aren't going away as a result of this revolution. They're actually getting greater. There was a point in time in the last century where when the world faced an existential threat, when the United States faced an existential threat, we invested in the technology, foreign policy skills, the language skills that allowed us to address the nuclear threat in a sophisticated way. We have not come close to doing that yet, to understanding what the trends are on a country by country basis in affecting the trends in energy investment. And if we understand this as an existential issue for our future, we're going to have to make those kinds of transitions to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pascual, and thank you, Dr. Birol. The problem with moderating this panel with these two gentlemen is you cannot interrupt them, but they eat all the time. But we are still going to find some time, maybe less than what we originally intended, to get some Q&A. And I have to trash all the questions I have prepared for them. But I still would like to ask a very basic, it's not actually a question. One of the things that Fred Kemp picked up on his closing remarks at the opening session was about Secretary Moniz making a reference to the energy security being a global issue rather than a national issue or even a regional issue. I actually picked up on another remark that the Secretary Moniz made, and he said something along the lines, innovating business models in energy are actually more difficult than innovating energy technologies. So in that spirit, I wanted to ask Fatih Bey first, and then Ambassador, please feel free to think. Because the International Energy Agency not only publishes the wonderful World Energy Outlook, it also prepares special reports, and one of the one that I found most interesting was the World Energy Investment Outlook, which was, I believe, published in May. And it really, what it says in this book goes hand in hand what both the ambassador has said, what Fatih Bey has said, and I think what's going to be discussed over this thing. Just without taking the role from, especially Fatih Bey, he talks about there a number of $48 trillion. And I'm going to just basically let him to give to us, to this audience, if I may, like a 3-minute rundown, maybe a one-slide version of this book. I know it's hard, but the reason why I'm asking this is so that everybody knows. Tomorrow morning, as part of this summit, we will have a very special closed ministerial session with about 17 ministers of energy participating. And Dr. Birol is going to do the opening presentation. And the topic of that particular session is financing critical energy infrastructure investments. That shows that the whole world is interested in this topic. And if you could also elaborate after that very briefly about since you mentioned about Paris, the name OECD came up on various occasions with vis-a-vis nuclear and other things like that. How do you see the future role of the OECD in this whole thing? And is there a new business model, as the Secretary mentioned, maybe even after Paris? Thank you.
So perhaps I can start and Ambassador Pascual can elaborate. Now, in terms of investments, the amount of money needed for the energy investments growth, for power plants, pipelines, oil fields, all other the renewables, there is enough money in the world. The problem is whether or not the energy sector will be able to attract this investment. Money goes there where there is the least risk and the safe return. And many parts of the energy supply chain today seems to have difficulties to attract investments. What are those? There are some areas which are easy. For example, in Europe, renewable gets a significant amount of investments. In US, shale gas, no problem. The problems what I see today is something which is very boring for many of us, but which is very important. It is mainly for the transmission and distribution lines. There are not enough investment being put forward to connect the grids, especially in a renewable growing context. Renewables are very good, and to make Adnan happy here, good for us, good for energy security, for climate change, but it poses some challenges, and to get some T&D, transmission and distribution investment, is a challenge number one. Challenge number two for me is the oil investments in Middle East countries. Challenge number three, again, for me is Ambassador Pascual mentioned, in electricity power investment in sub-Saharan Africa and India. In many cases, the current business models, as Orhan Bey said, may well not work, especially for T&D, which is for me a major question mark. Second part of your question, to finish the 3 minutes, the future of the OECD, the future of the IEA. When IEA was founded, our member countries consumed about 65% of the global oil. And the main foundation of the reason of founding the IEA was for the oil security. And today, IEA countries put together, they consume less than 50%, and tomorrow it will go to 30%. So in order to make IEA stronger, more relevant, I think the way forward goes through working much more closely and getting on board several key players in the market.
Ambassador Pascual?
I'll just say one thing about business models focused on energy access. A lot of times, many people say that the way that we need to do this is to leapfrog over past technology, look at distributed generation systems, off-grid models for generation. This is where the new business models absolutely become critical and difficult. Let's take India as an example. The 300 million people in India without access to electricity, about half of those is estimated that they're going to have to get their power through some form of off-grid mechanism. Generally, some experts that have been working throughout India have argued that you need to do this on a village-by-village basis, and that the ideal level of investment is really small, like about 10 kilowatts. So you have 150 million people. The average size of a village in India is about 1,500 people. That means you have to repeat this business model 100,000 times in order to be able to succeed, which means that you have to have intermediaries and actors dispersed throughout the ground that have the financing capacity and the ability to deliver a product and servicing of that product. And you're doing all of that, and you're producing 1,000 megawatts, right? And it's dealing with those kinds of business realities that we have not come to terms with on how it's going to get financed, how to work with local intermediaries, and how to create the confidence in the technologies that are being extended and the ability to service them.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have been warned by my colleagues, and I really sincerely apologize for that, but I don't think we are going to have any time for taking questions from the floor. We need to go The presentations lasted than I expected, and I hope you understand. I think Dr. Birol is going to be here for the next couple of days, so please feel free to catch him. And I understand, Ambassador Pascual, you probably have to leave at the end of the day. Again, my apologies, but our next session is very important. It's a luncheon next door with the Chairman John Huntsman and the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Dr. Moniz. Please, they asked me to remind you that to wear your credentials at all time. And if you do have a headset, bring it along from one thing. Thank you very much for our panelists and to all of you for listening to us for an hour and a half. Thank you.